Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to the NSF ISR webinar series. This particular webinar is the clarification of AS9100 2016. Today our presenter is Don McFarland. Don is the Aerospace Technical Scheme Manager and Aerospace Auditor for AS9100, 9110, and 9120 for NSF ISR. He has worked as a quality engineer, quality director, facility security officer, consultant, lead auditor, and auditor instructor in various organizations. Thank you, Don, for taking the time today to do this webinar. I'm going to mute all of the phones today, so please use the chat function if you have any questions throughout the webinar. At the end of the webinar, we will do some question and answers with Don. As a follow-up, everybody here will receive a recording of the webinar as well as a PDF of the slides. Thank you again for joining this webinar for NSF ISR, and thank you for your continued support. Go ahead, Don, whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much. So as Katie mentioned, my name is Don McFarland. I'm the Technical Scheme Manager with NSF. I'm joined by my cohort in crime, Mr. Mike McRandall, who's the Business Unit Manager for Aerospace. I'll be doing a bulk of the presenting, but Mike will interject some comments and participate as he deems necessary. So with that said, we'll get started. The topic for today is going to be, as usual, we'll go through our transition plan benchmarks. We'll talk some clarifications associated with the standard, and then open it up to the Q&A period that Katie mentioned. So first, we're going to get into the transition plan benchmarks. And again, this is a rehash of what we've talked about every month for the last year, making sure that everybody's up to speed. So as you can see, all of our 2017 benchmarks have been hit, other than a risk mitigation plan that we, the CB, have to perform for our accreditation body, which is ANAD. That's due to them by December 1st. We're going to try and get it done mid-November just so we can enjoy our holidays as well. But this is a mitigation plan for us to ensure that we've got a good idea of who's transitioned and ensuring that we have enough resources to make it through the remaining transitions that need to happen over the course of 2018. With that said, the 2018 benchmarks are really, really few. The first one here is kind of an arbitrary line in the sand that NSF has drawn, and it's for June 2018. This is the date for the time frame by which we want to have all of the upgrade audits completed. And the reason for that, again, as we know, the standard cancels on 9/15 of 18, and we have to have all audits completed, all corrective actions closed, and the reviews done prior to that date. Because if it's not updated, not completed by that time, your certificate rides off into the sunset, and we don't want that. So in order to make sure we're in a good position, we want to have all of our audits completed by June of 2018. So if you haven't got it scheduled yet, make sure you do, and make sure you're asking for time frames prior to June of 2018. With that said, we'll get into some of the clarifications, and I'm going to try something a little different to introduce this topic. We're going to try a poll, and Katie may have to help me here. So the poll here is the quality manual a required element under AS9100D? And I'm hoping everybody can see that, and we want to get just a few answers here. So if you go ahead and fill in what your answer is. I'll give you just another minute. Not quite a minute. This warms my heart. That's about 2/3 of you have participated, and you can see the results are pretty well split. I'll give you 5 more seconds. All right. So the results we got, majority of the folks are saying no. But we've got a few that are saying yes. And let me tell you, the answer is truly no. Quality manual is not required. With that said, there is a requirement for documented information. That comes from clause 4.4.2. You can see the bold section here that says an organization shall establish and maintain documented information that includes description of the relevant interested parties, scope of the QMS, description of the processes needed, sequence of interaction, and the assignment of responsibilities. It says it can be compiled into a single document and may be referred to as a quality manual. but it does not have to be. So frankly, if your interaction of processes is a separate and standalone document, that is perfectly fine. There is no requirement for that to be a quality manual, and there is no requirement for a quality manual to exist any longer. You can see this clarification here. So this comes right out of the 9100D standard. And this 9100 2016 FAQ says the standard does not mention a quality manual as it's still required. It says a quality manual is no longer specifically required. There are some documented information items that are necessary, but it can be done in either a quality manual or a variety of other formats that are perfectly acceptable. So really the point of that introduction was to tell you that there's a lot of misconceptions that exist, and sometimes it's because the wording of the standard itself. So the IAQG has created this clarifications document that's available on the IAQG Deployment Support Materials website. So if we click this Deployment Support Materials link from the IAQG and go to the 9100's page, you'll see this 9100 2016 clarification document. And that's really what we're going to go through today. This is published through the sector document reps. So each sector, the Asia Pacific sector, European sector, and the America sector all have representatives responsible for each of the documents under the standard. And there's an international document rep as well. They'll get together, collect all the feedback that's been sent in over the period of time, and they'll put it into these clarification documents as necessary to ensure that all of us, auditors and clients and certified organizations, are on the same page for expectation. So really what we want to go through today, or what I wanted to focus on today, is some of the resources that exist here. And we're going to specifically go through the 9100 clarifications document and ensure that we understand that. But I also want to highlight there are more items here, like the FAQ that's listed just above that. And then some other documents associated with the transition efforts can be found in here as well. If you're more of a 9120 person or a 9110 person, there are landing pages associated with each of those standards, and similar documents do exist for those as well. So feel free to go look those up. But today we're going to focus primarily on the 9100 because, again, that's the bulk of the certification schemes that exist. So the layout of this clarifications document is this columnar approach that you can see on the left-hand side, and the layout for the presentation is going to be, I'm going to put the requirement over here along with the clarification request, or the inquiries that were sent into the sector document reps or the international document rep, and then their response to it over here. And then on the right-hand side of the slide, you're going to see some feedback or some bulletized items associated with our response or our clarifications tied to that, just a simplified version of it. So as you can see, that the layout here, it contains a clause, clarification, request, and clarification. Some are older, and they've carried from the previous version. We found a couple that are still referencing the old version, the old numbers, the old standard. Those are being worked on. The feedback's been given to the IDR, so that should be encompassed into the next version. With that said, it's updated periodically, so make sure you keep an eye on the revision indicator that's in the footer, because that's going to be pertinent. We want to use the latest and greatest version as we do in our systems back home. And that revision indicator will be on the left-hand side down here in the footer of the document itself. I've omitted it on the slides for the sake of clarification, just to keep the slides a little cleaner. So with that said, we'll get into some of the content here. First one comes from clause 4.2. And rather than reading through the entirety of the clarifications here, I'm just going to hit a couple of the highlights. It says, in accordance with the clause 4.2, understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties, we need to determine, or shall the organization determine every relevant interested party and its requirements? Bluntly, the answer is no. Relevant is the key word, it's the operative word, and relevance is determined by the organization. So we do not need, as a third party, we do not need to identify the acceptable or relevant organizations tied to the client, tied to the certified organization. That's up to the certified organization to determine. An accepted practice is to use categories. For example, no need to list every customer, every employee. So we can kind of summarize those into high-level stakeholders or high-level interested parties and ensure that we're identifying what they need from us as a certified organization. Again, this is absolutely critical and paramount to the success of the system because this gives us an idea and an understanding of what our stakeholders want and need. And as we all know, that's going to be very, very important for us to determine so that we can build our system around meeting the needs of our customers, our stakeholders, our interested parties from all sides. Now, again, what about some of the safety partners like OSHA or your state-run safety and health organizations? Do they need to be listed on here? Again, I'm going to say it's as determined to be relevant and determined by the organization. So if you don't have them listed, you've made the determination that they're not terribly pertinent to your business. That's up to you. The auditor cannot and should not be saying you have to list those interested parties because you get to make the determination as to what's relevant. But if there is some statutory or regulatory requirement associated with the contract you're building, it's going to be pretty important that you understand those requirements so you can build your system with that in mind. Next slide talks to section 4.3. Is the aerospace manufacturer or assembler that builds and delivers product to customer engineering requirements, like a build-to-print organization, able to justify having clause 8.3 as not applicable if they can contract design, make, and sell tooling for the customer? Tooling can consist of tooling to verify parts or fixtures that assist in production of flight hardware. And the answer here is it depends. If that tooling is deliverable to the customer, it's something that the customer is buying and paying for as a service, you are a tooling designer in addition to maybe a widget manufacturer. And if you have a tool that you're designing and building for the customer that becomes customer-owned property, yes, design would be appropriate for your organization. If it's tooling that is not contracted, but it's something that we as an organization, or you as an organization rather, need in order to build your product, like a mold. If your mold is not customer-owned or you're not designing it for the customer, you're just using that as a means to make a product, then you are not a design firm. So the difference here is if it's deliverable, design responsibility becomes more applicable for the tooling creation. So with that said, we'll move on to the next clarification. Mike, feel free to jump in at any time here as you feel necessary, okay?
No problem.
The next clarification comes from 441, and some of these early ones I want to hit in particular because they have a lot to do with determining the scope and the context of the organization. And this one says, is the use of the process diagram in the IAQG 9100 Figure 2 from Clause 032 in your quality manual for interaction of processes sufficient? And you can see on the right-hand side, I've shown a picture of that Figure 2 diagram. The brutal answer is no, it's not. The IAQG has said that we want a process-based standard. You determine what the sequence of what the processes are and their sequence of interaction, but this is not a representation of processes. This is a representation of the clauses associated with the system in the Plan, Do, Check, Act type model. So we'd want to identify what your processes are, as stated in Section 4, and then understand the sequence and interaction of those processes. So that's a good clarification there. We still see that quite often in the quality manual or relevant documented information. We'll see this 9100 specific PDCA type model representing the company's sequence and interaction, and they've said that that's not appropriate. So under 441C, is it required to control the non-conforming outputs, clause 8.7, processes? Do they need to have measurables? Do they need to have KPIs? Now, let me clarify this a little bit. So anything that's tied to a clause 8 element has to be reported on a pair. And that is the Process Effectiveness Assessment Report. You can see that breakdown right here. So all processes with a clause 8 element have to be on a pair. And anything that has a pair tied to it needs to have measurables. needs to have some KPIs or some quality objectives, some measurable indicators of process performance. You as a client organization get to decide where these clauses fit into your process. But if you put clause 8.7 under, say, a management process or a quality system process, because it's tied to clause 8, now it's a pair process, and now there are process KPIs that need to be associated with that. Likewise, the second item or second clarification here under 441, I'm going to summarize it to say we can't have generic company-level KPIs of on-time delivery and customer satisfaction or product quality be representative of all processes. Process KPIs need to be selected to measure the effectiveness of the process rather than the overall system metric. So that's what this says, and feel free to read it at your leisure, but we need to make sure we're selecting the right measures. We did a great webinar a few months back on KPIs and selecting KPIs to ensure process improvements and monitoring our process effectiveness. And if you haven't watched that or you weren't participating in that, man, I'd recommend you go look at it. We use some great sports analogies to help tell the story of why we want to use KPIs tied to the individual processes rather than evaluating all of the processes by the same indicators. So if you haven't watched it, go watch it. And for clarification's sake, we cannot use, based on this clarification, we cannot use the system-level KPIs or quality objectives as a means of evaluating lower-level processes. That is grounds for nonconformity based on that. We want to make sure everybody's aware of that so you have plenty of time to go create these process-level KPIs if you don't already have them, okay? With that said, we'll move into section 5.3, and these are kind of linked together here, talking about the management rep. First one is asking, does the management rep have to report to top management? The second one, does the management rep have to monitor everything? Both are no. The top management can build the organizational structure how they want, but the management rep needs to have access to the top management individual or individuals. They don't necessarily need to work directly for them. The whole intent here is that when that management rep who's responsible for the implementation, communication of the system has a problem, they have the ability to go to top management without watering it down or filtering the message through another level of management. They have the ability to go say that what needs to be said to top management and keep them informed of the necessity of change. And likewise, management rep doesn't have to perform all that monitoring work themselves. In fact, I'd recommend that they don't, because we want to let the process owners track their performance. Management rep certainly needs to be involved in some level of that, make sure that it's still relevant to the organization and still compliant with the standard. But if we don't let the folks responsible for the process control their process, we're really giving them an excuse to get out of some things that they should be responsible for. So it's pretty pertinent that we have all of the right players involved in tracking the system along the way. Section 6.3 is the next one here. This talks about change. It says when the organization determined the need for change to the QMS, the changes shall be carried out in a planned manner, and then it refers us back to section 4.4. It says what are the expectations, what level of change requires planning. And the clarification here says the change requirement references 4.4, so the standard is including these top-level QMS process type changes. So it's not that that's the only level of change that needs to be considered. It's saying specifically if you're doing change, it may impact the scope, it may impact the processes or their interaction and sequence. So we certainly want to ensure that if it does touch those, we're considering it a change and we are executing it in a controlled manner. There may be lower level change that doesn't impact that scope level. We still want to go in a controlled manner, and it may be through an ECO, ECN type process or a process change equivalent. Otherwise, if it's going to be at that higher level, it may require some documentation, some management involvement, perhaps some Kaizen type activities. But either way, we need to monitor it and ensure that the changes don't have deleterious effects on the system. Okay, next slide's talking about 715, and as we know, this is the new location for calibration or monitoring and measurement tools. A couple items here kind of bulletized. Customer-supplied measurement tools are not an exception to the rule, and that's really the first one here. What it's talking about is if I get a tool that's supplied by the customer, am I still responsible for it? Do I have to calibrate it, even if the customer comes back and says, I don't need to? They've given me a waiver saying it doesn't need to be calibrated. The answer is absolutely. If it's a measurement tool, it's got to be calibrated, even if it's customer-owned. You still take the ownership of that as the certified organization. Traceability to NIST or National Standard Equivalent isn't required to be stated on the certificate. I know there have been some auditors that have pushed back on that, saying we want to see something on the certificate that says traceable to NIST or equivalent, and that's not the intent. The intent is you partnered as a certified organization, you partner with a calibration external provider or supplier that has the system in place to ensure the traceability. And if you partnered with the right people, they may or may not put that on the certificate. What we're looking for is that it's traceable back to one of those external providers, or if you've done it internally, you have some traceability back to national or international standards so that we know that the tools are good. But it does not have to be explicitly stated on the certificate that it's this standard is traceable to NIST, although the good shops usually do that anyways. And the last one here talks about the register. And I know we've talked about the register requirement before, but the 2009 verbiage required a register and the definition of the processes for calibration or verification separately. The new standard really mandates these definitions to be incorporated into the register itself as opposed to just being defined. When asked, the IDR said, no, that wasn't our intent. The wording did change, but the intent was not to change the location or the way we do things. We have a register that allows us to recall and manage our tools. We have methodologies defined for how we calibrate them, but they don't necessarily have to be one and the same. So really no change was intended, even though the verbiage was changed. Okay. Under 814, can a destroyed counterfeit part be returned to the supplier for credit? And the answer is it depends. There's no issue returning counterfeit parts that are made unusable. Counterfeit parts, as we know, are part of our nonconforming product. They're a subset of nonconforming product. So if we're deeming that this counterfeit part is scrap, we need to either positively control or permanently and conspicuously mark until physically rendered unusable. Now, in this case, if we're going to return it back to the supplier, we need to physically render unusable so that there's no risk of reentry into the value stream. Now, of course, there are exceptions to every rule, and sometimes we may not need to physically render it unusable because there may be some regulatory authority that needs to be involved to ensure or to prosecute, to investigate, whatever it might be. We need to ensure that we need to ensure that the prevention of reentry into the value stream occurs. We want to make sure that those parts are not subject to being introduced in the product again. Okay. Under section 8.2, where is the requirement within 9100 for superseded obsolete specs or material? Here are the questions I have in regard to it. If a customer with an old drawing references obsolete specs or materials, would I have to comply with the old documentation, or could I comply with the new superseded version? As you know, we're in a world that has some very antiquated drawings and still references some old mill specs or documents that were obsoleted back in the 80s or even earlier. If the contract says X, we have to perform to X. We can't assume that because Y is the new X, that Y is okay. If the requirements are the requirements are clearly stated and we can't do that, we need to push back. And the standard says we have to clarify those requirements when they don't make sense. Don't assume anything, okay? So customer contract requirements need to be clarified or confirmed when concerns arise and not making assumptions. But no, as a clarification, we cannot work to the latest and greatest spec if a specific revision indicator or revision number of a specification is called out in a customer contract. Okay, the next one here is from Clause 8.3, and this is the design and development clause as we know. First one says a build-to-print organization receives only product specification and drawings to manufacture to product. The organization must develop and invalidate a complex manufacturing process to achieve the results. Are they required to use design and development processes? No. The answer is no. Process design and development is not required to be handled under 8.3, but as an organization, you can certainly choose to utilize that design and development process to your benefit. Sometimes it may be beneficial for you to develop a process that meets your needs or meets the needs of your customers by going through some iterative design elements. And if you choose to do so, that's great, but you are not required to under 8.3. You're not required to comply with 8.3 for process design and development. It's more for service and product design. Okay, second item says the definitions for verification validation activities applied don't really match up with the DO 254. How do I justify this? Remember, statutory and regulatory requirements take precedence. So if the customer's statutory regulatory requirements say otherwise, that's what you're going to do. If it's not specified, you're going to follow the requirements of AS9100. Bottom line, you follow your customer's requirements, and if the customer doesn't tell you anything otherwise, you're going to do what the AS9100 says. Okay? The last item is talking about change. Do we need to notify our customers of change if we're design responsible? And of course, the answer is it depends. And what I mean is if the design invalidates your compliance with the contract, the customer's contract, of course you'll have to notify. If you're changing something that doesn't deviate from contract requirement, doesn't change the compliance of the product to that requirement, you're perfectly fine to handle that internally. Now, keep in mind, there may be some contract requirements from the customer that say you're going to notify us of any change to product or process because you've got like a baseline freeze invoked. And if that's the case, you'll have to provide some notification that the formulation is changing, the process is changing, or whatever it might be. So with that said, we'll move on to Section 8.4.1. This is under procurement. As we know, there's quite a few under this section. First one's talking about customer supplied material or government furnished equipment. Are we still responsible? Do we still need to keep track of performance of these customer supplied items? And the answer is yeah, of course. You may not be able to fire your customers, you may not be able to fire the government, but if it's a supplier or a external provider, we still need to monitor the supplier performance because the data is going to help us to tell the story and track the performance associated with where we may have struggled. So we need to be able to tell that story using the data, and specifically it's talking about delivery or on-time delivery and quality impacts because it's going to be a lot easier for us to tell the story if our customer or the government has caused us to miss delivery dates if we have all this data maintained along the way. I'm sure you can all agree that sometimes our customers are the worst suppliers. Having the data allows you to tell that story a little more quantitatively than emotionally. Next item here talks to periodic reassessment of the external providers. Does it apply to tooling suppliers, calibration service suppliers, or just airplane part suppliers, quote unquote? The answer is yeah, we got to monitor the performance of all of our suppliers. But under Clause 841, the second bullet here, or the second part of that says the type and extent of the control applied to the supplier and the purchased product shall be dependent on the effect of the purchased product on subsequent product realization or the final product. That means we're not going to necessarily treat our chemical suppliers the same as we would our aluminum supplier or perhaps our tooling suppliers. We can tailor the way we monitor them or the level to which we monitor them on an ongoing basis. But we do need to be monitoring our suppliers, even those that are tooling suppliers or calibration services, anything that's going to go into product or service conformity. Okay, the next slide talks to purchasing again. Says, is a calibration supplier required to be accredited? And, of course, it depends is the appropriate answer. 9100, 9110, 9120 do not require 17025 ISO, AS accreditation. That's where you as a supplier or you as a certified organization need to determine what we have to have or what you have to have for your calibration services. If you need that level, meaning 17025 calibration house or maybe an ISO or an AS certification, then you flow that down in your contract. But if you don't need it, you just need somebody that's capable of doing calibration, provides a certificate traceable to NIST, then you'd flow that information down. Really, it's up to you and the customer contract, the type of product that you're involved in, et cetera. That's going to be a determination for you. Next item says if evaluate refers to an initial evaluation, can that initial evaluation occur after the supplier has been selected and placed on the register, such as in the case of a supplier who is evaluated based on an evaluation of initial part after receipt? And if we read through that section, it's going to say, no, not really. We're evaluating them initially based on their ability to supply the product. Then we're going to approve them. And it even talks to, over in the right-hand side here, we can use a conditionally approved status to ensure that we meet the requirements initially, and then we conditionally approve them to supply product. And if they deliver good widgets, then we can approve them unconditionally. Or perhaps we want to approve them only for a specific commodity or product type. But again, what this is clarifying is that initial evaluation refers to some analysis prior to supplying or submitting the first order to make sure that they're a good fit for our business. Common criteria here may be creditworthiness, location, type of commodity, franchised versus non-franchised, maybe an ISO or an AS certification, things like that. But the standard requires that we have criteria, and we evaluate them against that criteria, and we've got some documented information associated with it. The next one here, what is meant by an external provider in Clause 8411B? Does this mean that an organization must maintain a register of all external providers, or is a register limited to a subset sufficient? Based on the clause, it says the type and extent of control. Our organization maintains a register for Class 1 product and service suppliers. So it says we're applying this to all the external providers that affect process, product, or service conformity. So this could be somebody that's taking our scrap away because that's controlled non-conforming product and they're supplying a certificate of destruction associated with it. That could be the person that's taking our shredding material away or our paper that's going to be shredded away, because they're going to be definitely involved in ensuring that we have protected the sensitive information from our customers. It could be somebody that's supplying chemicals associated with our manufacturing process, say cutting fluid for a machining operation, or product raw materials, inserts, screws, nuts, bolts, or even the aluminum or the chassis or the paint itself, stuff that's going to be incorporated in the product. So it can be both direct and indirect involvement as far as the effect on process, product, or service conformity. We need to control all of those. So the type and extent of the control is based on the scope of certification and the supplier impact on product conformity, meaning the people supplying cutting fluid for the machining don't necessarily need to be treated the same as our raw material supplier themselves. But we do need to have the register associated with everybody, not just the level 1, tier A, whatever criteria you want. It's got to be associated with all the suppliers that affect product and service conformity. Are all external providers required to have a formalized risk assessment? This may come as a shock. The answer is no. Organization is required to develop a process for assessing and managing supplier risks in accordance with the Clause 811, It does not require every supplier to be assessed for risk. For example, the organization may want to define its process where supplier risk is based on process, commodity, product, or performance. Again, we can treat the different tiers of suppliers differently because the risk associated with cutting fluid, as an example, is going to be different than the risk of aluminum or paint. We're going to treat each of those suppliers as according to the risk that they present and ensure that we've got the ability to tell that story. 842. Some international customers insist on signed CFCs. Says no, that's not a requirement. If there's a block that includes a space for a signature, it could be either signed, stamped, or marked digitally. Because we want to, if it's got a blank and it doesn't have any indication of signature, it can be really tough to show that it was correct information. Under 842, it also says, if I get a CFC, do I need to review it? Of course, if you're using that report for acceptance, we probably need to make sure, we need to make sure that the report is adequate for our needs. So just the presence of a CFC isn't enough. We want to make sure that that CFC says compliant to AMSQQ or whatever standard you're looking for. Whatever CFC is designed to demonstrate conformity to, we need to ensure that that's being reviewed as a part of that receiving inspection process. Of course, at your defined sampling plan, not everything has to be looked at 100%. But if we're getting a CFC, we certainly want to be making sure that the CFC or the certificate's information is adequate to demonstrate conformance. The last one there says, when a customer or organization has identified raw material as a significant operational risk, like a critical item, the organization shall implement a process to validate the accuracy of test reports. What does this look like in practice? Do we have to be there when they are performing the test to validate the accuracy or perform the same test internally? Again, it depends. If the product is determined to be a high-risk item, it may be advantageous for you as an organization to send it out for additional third-party testing. We may not want to confirm all of our product is good based on one CFC from the manufacturer. We may do some independent lab analysis through a third party or maybe an internal lab just to confirm that the CFC content is correct. It really depends on the risk associated with it and what your organization is willing to live with, or perhaps what your customers have told you you're willing to live with. But it's not necessarily, it's not going to be obligatory for you to do it in all cases, but if there is additional risk, you definitely want to mitigate that through an acceptable means. Excuse me. So the next slide talks to 843. And as we know, this is the flowdown information associated with our procurement contracts to our suppliers. It says, do companies have to flow down all of the requirements? And the clarification here, I think, is one of the most pertinent. Says, we've removed the words where appropriate, given that the clause 4.3 allows organizations to apply these requirements where applicable or when applicable. So even though the clause itself doesn't say where appropriate, the standard is geared to that end. So we can determine what portions of 8.4.3 are not appropriate or not applicable to the organization, meaning, in short, we don't have to flow all of those clauses down. They're not all mandatory flow downs. I know several auditors and several client organizations that have misunderstood this, and this is the clarification that says we don't have to do it for everything. Likewise, the next one here says the standard requires that purchasing information identify purchased product. It says identification of relevant technical data is still included. We're still identifying the revision status. There was really no change to that one. 843K, does the standard require flow down of 9100 into supplier or sub-tier contracts? Again, I've heard auditors say this, that the new standard says we have to flow down a quality system, and the answer is, of course, no. It's only a requirement if there is a customer contractual requirement or an organization QMS requirement, meaning I will not deal with anybody that isn't ISO or AS certified. We can flow that down to a select group or tier of suppliers based on commodity, or we can choose not to flow it down at all depending on the risk associated with that product, and it's the organization's determination. Of course, the customer's input is going to be critical in helping you to determine what needs to be flowed down, but it's ultimately your determination as to when that's going to be flowed down to your sub-tiers. The last one talks about notifications and when approval is needed. It says, is this for any supplier, sub-tier supplier, even if it's not a company-directed source? Suppliers change their sub-tiers all the time, and unless they have a company-source directed supplier, they do not have to notify us, and we do not have to give them approval. So the clarification tells us over here, this requirement starts with the organization shall communicate to the external providers its requirements for the need to. So if you flow down that your sub-tier has to communicate to you any changes to product process, location, quality system, management, address, whatever, they need to do it. That's now part of the contract with you. Likewise, if your customers flow that to you and there's something in the customer contract that says that this needs to be flowed to all tiers of the supply chain, you'll obviously need to flow that down to all of your sub-tiers as well. Okay. Next slide talks about the production aspect. It says build to print organization required to define KCDs, key characteristic dimensions, if they're not established by the customer. In short, no, you don't have to. It's going to be defined in the design. But if there's something that you find as an organization that may be critical to your process, you can certainly identify additional key characteristics. If the customer has specified key characteristics, you need to treat them as such, but you can definitely go above and beyond what the customer has notified you of or told you of. Second item there says, please confirm if 9100 requires organizations to document evidence that production processes produce parts and assemblies that meet all specification requirements, and if so, please state where the requirement is. So there's a bunch of places through the standard that tell us we have to have evidence of the completion of tasks, at a minimum saying acceptable or reject. And if there are reject records, they have to have the nature of the nonconformity, the subsequent action taken. So even though it's not explicitly stated in 8.5 that we have to have that, it is invoked throughout the rest of the standard and can definitely be considered a requirement. 8511, what kind of equipment is included in the term production equipment associated with the reference clause? For example, would a forklift be considered production equipment requiring validation? It's amazing to me that this is still a question. Forklift moves or transports the parts, and it is controlled through the infrastructure, the preventive maintenance, or maybe the work environment type aspect. There's a separate section for that. Under 8511, it's talking about equipment used to control the value-added portion of it, and we're wanting to validate that it's going to work, that it's going to function, that it's going to do what it's supposed to do. Now, if the size of the forks maybe makes a difference because you've had to customize a pallet or a lift mechanism for the product, perhaps that's something that needs to be validated so that it's not going to have deleterious effects on the product. But in general, those lifting and moving type items don't need to be validated as part of the production process validation, or equipment validation, rather. 8513, so this is our FAI type requirement. A couple different bullets here. Says, does the 9100 require production process verification of all assemblies? Is an organization required to have production process verification records for all parts, including supplier parts? And the answer, of course, is it depends. You guys need to determine what production process verification exists and what parts or assemblies need to be done. Ultimately, the focus here is to ensure that the process worked, that we've defined a good and acceptable process capable of building an acceptable widget or a good conforming service. We're trying to confirm that through this first article through the first piece. Sometimes that PPV is going to be utilized, or the FAI is going to be utilized to reconfirm that or initially confirm that it works. There may be other mechanisms that exist to do this validation effort. How you do it is really dependent on your organization and your needs. And again, your customer's flow downs, because if the customer says, thou shalt do a 9102 first article, you're kind of locked into doing a first article. What the standard says is we have to have a mechanism to confirm that our processes are capable in building an acceptable service or widget, and it's going to be reconfirmed as necessary when things invalidate the original process, like a change to a fixture as stated in this last bullet here. Okay? If we tear down a fixture, there's definitely risk. Some companies will consider the removal of an employee, meaning a shift change, as a risk because now you're introducing a new variable. So they'll redo a first article, not necessarily to a 9102 level, but they'll redo a first article associated with that to ensure that we haven't changed the recipe enough to cause harm to the product. Again, it's up to the organization. As long as they're addressing the need for confirming the process, they'll meet the intent, meet the requirement here. What is a PPAP versus a FAI, and is there a difference? This is really going into, yeah, there's a difference. We need to have a process for the production process verification, making sure that the product works, and then the organization uses a represented item as the first production run of a new part to verify the production process, production documentation, and tooling are able to produce parts and assemblies that meet the requirements. Again, PPVs are production process validations. We can accomplish a PPV type approach using a first article. It may be a little more complicated than that. Again, it's going to depend on the risk associated with the product. It talks about PPAPs in here over on the clarification side. It was not the intent for the team to require PPAPs or process capability for each production process. But man, it's a good tool if you have the ability, you have the resources, and it makes sense for your organization. It's not a bad tool to implement. Okay, it's not a mandatory thing, but it's certainly something that you can look at. Moving on, 852. This one talks to traceability. It says, do we need to have traceability to the people that did the work? The standard is built around traceability of the product, and we have records associated with who's done the different tasks along the way. If it makes sense for the organization, again, based on the risk associated, they may dictate that traceability could be taken to a whole nother level, meaning we need to record everybody that's touched or looked at the product or involved in a particular sequence, and we need to record the tools that were used for measurements, the environmental conditions associated with it, etc. The standard doesn't dictate that. All it says is we're going to do it to the appropriate level. Traceability is intended to be more product-related, and we have mechanisms to track the rest of it, the evidence of who performs the tasks, but they can really become blended together depending on the risk, and that could all be considered to be part of that traceability package. Is really what it's getting at here. Okay, the next item, if I can get my computer to cooperate, is under 855. Now, I put a couple editorial comments in here because this is one that companies try to exclude or define as not applicable. What it's saying over in the clarification says if a company does not provide service to products after the part is delivered to the customer, can they claim this clause is not applicable? And if you read through the clarification, it says if you're accepting RMAs, warranty or non-warranty, if you're accepting product back from your customer, you are responsible for post-delivery support. So if you're building a widget or delivering a service, it's going to be really tough for you to justify this clause as being not applicable. Now keep in mind, for the purpose of OASIS, the IAQG website, the exclusions are not applicables now are all or none. So I can't call it out as being an 855 ACDE kind of a thing. You're either compliant to 855 or you take the entirety of it as not applicable according to the OASIS side. You can decide internally whether you want to do some of those things. My question to you is, if you read the verbiage, it says you need to consider all of those things. Are you not considering it as you're doing that warranty work? Even though some of them may not be appropriate or applicable to what you're doing, are you considering those things? If you're considering them, you're compliant to it. You don't need to worry about taking it as an exclusion or a not applicable. So really, we can't justify, or it's going to be very tough for us to justify this as a not applicable for most organizations, if not all organizations. And really, in your best interest, why would you? Because those are things that need to be considered as you're doing that post-delivery support, even if it's warranty work. Those are certainly things that you should and could be considering to show that you address that requirement. One other clarification.
Hey, Don?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, just one point on that. You hit on everything perfectly, and one thing that I want to stress to everybody listening is in that description and in that clarification, it tells you product that is found to be nonconforming after delivery to the customer require actions to be taken. That's regardless of what you make. Even if you have a stipulation in your contract that you're not going to accept any returned product, the problem is if it's found to be nonconforming after you deliver it, you still have to take action. That is part of 855, and you really cannot make that part of 855 not applicable. So there's always going to be part of 855 applicable pretty much for any 9100 house.
Agreed. And I've left the arrow hovering over that handled through nonconforming product, but it's still being done bullet for a reason. Even though we may be not required to do anything, as Mike said, if we're creating a corrective action or a nonconformity request or something to that effect in our system, are we not taking action? Therefore, we are doing what 855 says. 855 isn't a standalone investigation type requirement per se. We can certainly be handling it through an existing system like nonconforming product, like corrective action, and still be compliant to the requirements of 855. Okay? Clause 8.7. This is, again, the nonconforming output section, as we know. It says our organization makes parts from foam, plastic, and fiberglass, and has, as such, it is impossible to permanently mark the scrap. Scrap is normally the excess material from die cutting, water jetting, or routing. We had special bins made that had scrap or trash on the sides. These bins are emptied into the trash compactor as they fill up. Is putting this type of material in a marked bin adequate, or does each piece need to be marked? So the clarification here that's worth mentioning, excess material is not scrap. It's conforming material that's just cut into a shape that's not what the customer wants, but it's still good material. And if you had something that can be fit into that pattern, could you not use it again? So that's not scrap. It's called drop material. The standard does not say, or does say rather, through clarification, that we do not have to put drop or excess material through the nonconforming process. Okay? Pretty cool clarification, because that's a lot of legwork that we may not have to do. Now, if it is destined for scrap, if it is dispositioned as being scrap, wouldn't we want to permanently and conspicuously mark or positively control? Now, the standard gives us ideas of what permanently and conspicuously marked includes and what positively control means. Again, the intent here is to make sure that we don't have anybody unintentionally grabbing this stuff and reintroducing it into the value stream. Now, I'm going to show you in just a moment, there's an FAA directive that says what can be done for rendering the product unusable. These two mechanisms, permanently and conspicuously marking or positively controlling, are the stopgap until we physically render it unusable. So this is a means of keeping it identified or controlled until we destroy it. It's going to be dependent upon the environment, the material, how we're handling product, because we don't want to use a Sharpie and have it rubbed off. We don't want to use a paint material and have it be commingled with something else that's painted that color. We want to be able to differentiate good parts from bad parts. So it could be an administrative control in a system like a barcode. It could be, something on the outside of the box saying this is bad, don't use it, or physically marking it with a taped piece of paper. But somehow we're identifying this stuff as being non-conforming so that it doesn't inadvertently get mixed into the value stream. We can't work to the malicious intent here. We can probably build our processes with some of that in mind, but it's not necessary for us to build that level of control unless it's a concern for your particular organization. The standard doesn't say we have to prevent all malicious intent type events from occurring. Really, it talks more to the unintentional commingling of product. Okay, here's that FA order that I was talking about the ways to mutilate the scrap using the standard vernacular, physically rendering product unusable. You can see here's some examples, may be accomplished by one or more of the following or combination thereof: grinding, burning, removal of major integral features, or it could be something like removing manufacturer identification, part, lot, batch, or serial number, stuff that's required to fill out maybe a tag, an 8130 or something like that. Some of the examples that may be less successful, spraying with paint that really doesn't render it unusable because we can remove the paint, or stamping something like an R into the product because that can maybe be brushed out or something like that, or hammer marks. Those are tough to identify what they are unless they're going through. Drilling small holes can be covered or filled, so that may not be an option. Just keep in mind that we want to destroy it so that it doesn't get inadvertently mixed in. And this is also a good mechanism for us to help prevent counterfeit. Because who knows who's dumpster diving and what sort of malicious intent exists there. So if we're destroying a part so that it's unusable, we may be preventing somebody down the line from grabbing that and reintroducing it as being a good part, even perhaps with your manufacturing tag or part number on it, and selling it as an authentic part. So this becomes more critical with that in that context. The last two bullets here said, what are the difference between non-conforming product and counterfeit? Can destroyed counterfeit parts be returned for credit? Counterfeit, as we know, is a subset of non-conforming product. It is non-conforming product, going to be treated as such. We destroy it. The concept here is we may return it, but we don't want to reintroduce it in the supply chain so that it can be reused or be resold as counterfeit parts. Again, we may not want to destroy counterfeit parts. We may go with that positive control until we return it to a government authority or some investigating agency or something like that, depending on the nature of the problem. But we don't necessarily have to destroy it. But if we do destroy it, we can return it to the supplier for credit. A couple more slides to go here. The next one talks to 911. So that in accordance with the Clause 911 General, the organization shall retain appropriate documented information as evidence of the results. Please clarify what type of documented information is mentioned as a result of all monitoring, measurement, analysis, and evaluation activities, or only as a result of evaluating the performance and the effectiveness of the QMS. Lots of things are capable of being used as this documented information, but we're looking specifically for the performance and effectiveness of the QMS. So you're going to determine what's important to you and your organization, and you're going to retain the appropriate documented information as such. But we need to have, as it says right here, the results expected to answer this clause are only those related to process and performance effectiveness. So we need to make sure that we're keeping appropriate information related to that, but we don't necessarily need to have documented information associated with monitoring every facet of the business. Okay? 922 says, does the standard require the performance of an internal audit on an annual schedule? No. Audits are prioritized for areas of importance in the organization. We're going to tailor our audit program to be to ensure that we're auditing the areas that make money or that have problems, that there's risk, there's complexity, etc. But we do not have to, by the rules of the standard, have conducted an annual internal audit. You need to determine what is important for your business, and you need to ensure that you're following your planned arrangements. And that's really the extent of what this is telling us. We have to have an audit plan that determines all of those factors, and then we need to follow that plan. And if we run into resource constraints, top management gets notified and hopefully frees up some resources. As a recommendation, though, I would say it is definitely in your best interest to do your audits more frequently and for longer durations than what the CB performs. You know where the skeletons are buried in your organization, and you can certainly be more productive and more proactive in finding those skeletons and fixing them before they manifest into CB nonconformities or, more importantly, into product nonconformities or customer audit nonconformances. And really that's the intent behind the audit and the third-party audit program, is to ensure that we've got good processes in place, not guaranteeing good product, but good processes in place that are capable of building good product. And if our processes are conforming, then there's a good chance that we're going to have good widgets, good product, good service to our customers. So the better we do with our internal audit programs, the more successful we should be with delivering a good product or service to our customers. And the last clarification slide is again talking about internal auditing. Does the IAQG standard require the quality assurance manager to be the lead auditor? Of course not. You guys determine who the auditors are, the qualifications associated for those auditors. And oh, by the way, this clarification says what's required to be, or what's the required training to be an internal auditor. It says there's no specific requirement. You guys, again, determine what the necessary competence is associated with your internal auditor program. And if you need to be going to a third-party course or an external course or an internal course, it's up to you. You need to have competent individuals, and you need to ensure objectivity in the audits. So we can't really have the same quality manager type person being the only lead auditor, because it's going to be tough for them to be impartial and objective if they are auditing all of the facets of the company. The last bullet talks to ensuring results of the audits are fed back to the relevant manager. So the old standard said that we had to have the area or the management responsible for the area being audited take corrective action without undue delay. The new standard doesn't have that verbiage. It just says we have to identify our findings, we have to take action against those findings, but it doesn't point to exactly who has to do it, because there was some misinterpretation of the top management piece. If I'm an area supervisor, am I considered to be management responsible for the area? Some people said no. They were trying to use that as a scapegoat. Really, the intent here is we identify findings through the internal audit process. We take action to fix them so that they don't become bigger problems or manifest into product issues. But the last bullet here, and my clicker went away. There it is. What's important is the internal auditor is not the one making the correction and corrective action, since that would impact their objectivity. We need to get the process owners involved in fixing it. I'm sure you've heard me say it before, but one of the quotes that stuck with me for a long time is that we let the janitor pick his broom. We identify that something is broken, and we work with the process owners and stakeholders to ensure that we get the problem resolved and in a way that makes sense for their organization or for their department. Okay? I think I lied to you. It looks like there's one more slide associated with this under Section 10.2. This is NCRs and corrective actions. And the gist of this first bullet is, does a nonconformity equate to a corrective action? Do I have to elevate everything? And the answer is no, of course not. We need to determine when nonconformities need to become corrective actions, but sometimes it doesn't make sense for us to spend a lot of money and time to create a corrective action and execute that 8D process when there's not a return on it. And the language that's used in the clarification form here is it's not wise to expend significant resources for an isolated, low-cost nonconformity. So in my words, don't spend $1 to save a dime, unless, of course, it's maybe customer-facing or you're required to do it by the customer. But if it's something that's identified that isn't going to benefit from, or you won't benefit from going through an 8D corrective action type process, just fix it through nonconformity and move on. The second bullet talks to the human factors, says, does the standard mandate human factors training? Of course, the answer is no. It says we have to have an awareness of it, and it really doesn't even mandate that, but we're going to use that as a part of the corrective action because it says we have to consider human factors during the corrective action, and that part of that consideration may include training employees on it. And then under 10.2.1e, last one here says, requires organizations to update risks and opportunities to determine during planning if necessary. Does this need to be performed for every corrective action? It says the organization determines when to update risks and opportunities based on corrective actions. There is a risk feedback loop or possible escape from a risk process has occurred, and the organization determines if conclusion, risk, and opportunity planning is required. Translating that into Don's vernacular, we need to consider the risks and opportunities associated with NCRs and ensure that as a part of that feedback loop, we're learning the lessons once, we're not repeating them. So if we see something that's going to benefit other areas or other processes, we would want to definitely put that into the risks and opportunities loop and ensure that we're taking that into consideration as we continue to build our processes, or perhaps redefine or continue to improve our processes. But it's not a mandatory thing by any means. So that's the clarifications document. Again, that's as it stands today. This version that we went through is from July. So this gets updated fairly often. If you have a desire, go read through it at your leisure. If you have any questions, feel free to email us or contact us. At this point, I'm going to go through a couple more slides, but I want you guys to type any questions that you have into that chat function, and we'll go through and answer those as soon as I make it through a couple more slides here. So go ahead and get those questions coming in as I finish up these last couple slides talking about the available resources. In particular, I want to point to some of the IAQG resources, and this comes from the IAQG website. You can see the Supply Chain Management Handbook highlighted here on the left side, and then over here the 9100 Deployment Support Materials. You can also get to those deployment support materials right here as we talked earlier. All of these are excellent resources, free resources, and they're constantly updated to make sure that people are aware of the information that's coming. So please utilize those if you have any questions. Oftentimes when you contact the sector document reps through the OASIS feedback, they're going to point you to those locations. Likewise, if you contact Mike or me, we're probably going to point you there as well. Some of the NSF resources that exist can be found at our nsf.org website, in particularly the one that's listed here on this page. If you go to the AS9100 2016 page, this is where you'll find the webinar series and all of the documents that we've created associated with transition. Here's a listing of a few of those. So make sure you get a chance to, or have reviewed those, or if you haven't, go take a look. There's a lot of really good information there. And again, if you need additional resources, please notify us. We'd be happy to help. These are optional resources. They're not required, but we certainly want you to know that they exist. Any assistance we can provide in the transition process, we want to. As far as the topic for next month, risk-based thinking for the AS91XX organization. So this is your 9100, 9110, or 9120. We're going to talk about 9100 requirements related to risk-based thinking and the risk management methodologies commonly found in the aerospace community. It's going to be scalable to your needs and based on what programs you have in place, but we're going to talk about some of the basic components for that session. So Katie will get more information out to the group as far as when that presentation will occur, but just keep in mind that that's coming next month, and that should be a pretty good presentation. So I'm going to leave it on this slide. Again, that's our contact information for Mike and for me. If you have any questions, please contact us. We'd be happy to answer those. We get feedback all the time. we generally respond within a day or two, but please feel free to email us. Mike, anything you want to add before we jump into the Q&A?
No, not at all. You did an excellent job again, my friend.
Perfect. So I'm going to go through the questions just top to bottom here. And my friend Pradeep said, can I have a supplier evaluation be done with having a 9001 certificate? Can I get away from an assessment checklist or an on-site audit? And Pradeep, I'll say it depends on your needs. If you want to do an evaluation based on a checklist or using the criteria of just having a 9001 certificate, you can certainly do that. It's probably not an appropriate means for some of your more critical suppliers because, as you know, some companies that have a certificate probably lack some customer service type aspects, or they may not be a good fit for your business. But you can certainly use that as a criteria as long as you have a record to show that they've been evaluated or documented information to show that that was your criteria and they've been evaluated against that criteria. On-site audits are not required for any suppliers. You're going to make the determination if you're going to perform those on-site audits, and if you want to, you can do it. Next question here is product qualification equivalent to first production run or first article? There's a lot of similarities. Product qualification runs, in my mind, are a means of proving out the process or qualifying the process maybe in a larger scale than a first article. So first articles are usually the first pieces off, versus that product qualification run is where we confirm it in a larger quantity. Again, it depends on the volume that you're producing, maybe how many mold cavities you have in your tooling, a lot of things like that. So it's not really a one-size-fits-all, but there are definitely some similarities between the two programs. Next question. We build parts to customer print specification. When addressing product safety, if we meet all the customer requirements, the product should be safe using correct raw material, heat treated to spec. Is there anything else that we need to address for product safety? This is one of the questions that we get asked quite frequently. And if I read through the product safety clause here, it says the organization shall plan, implement, and control the processes needed to assure product safety during the entire product life cycle or as appropriate to the organization and its product. Examples include assessment of hazards and management of associated risks, management of safety critical items, analysis of reporting of occurred events affecting safety, communication of these events, and training of personnel. So it's not just the safety of the product. We're also talking about the safety of the operators, the safety of the employees while they're handling that product. Is there anything that's going to hurt me or hurt the product as we're going through our operations? We need to keep that in mind. And if we have an adverse event or if we have something that's going to impact it, maybe we do some training or we do some additional work to ensure that we're not going to have any other harmful events or harmful events towards our employees or towards the product. Okay. Next one says, can I audit my manager who is the management rep for the management review process? And I would say it depends. For somebody that's not the process owner of management review, but maybe a participant in management review, it may be appropriate, or you may have the objectivity needed to audit that process or to assess that process. Really, the intent is nobody will call their own child ugly, for lack of better descriptions here. We want to make sure that we're getting an objective look at the processes and ensuring that we're evaluating it against the criteria. And if I'm the one responsible for it, I may not go as deep as I need to. So if you're the one that's owning that process, you're definitely not objective. But if you're simply a participant or an executor of that process, you may be able to demonstrate objectivity associated with that activity. The next question here is 922C says allow, not require. From the clarification provided in the document, this appears to be a typo. Can you confirm?
I looked that up. I couldn't find 922C mentioning allow or require, so I'm not sure if it was another clause.
Yeah, I'm not sure because 922C is talking about select auditors and conduct audits to ensure objectivity and the impartiality of the audit process. So, I mean, ensure objectivity kind of alludes to a requirements, but I'm not really sure what this person was going at, so they're going after. Okay, well, I think that's about all we have. So on behalf of NSF, I want to say thank you to everybody for joining us. Thank you for listening. Thanks for your participation. Hopefully these webinars are of value to you and you see some gain as a result of it. If you have any feedback, please feel free to email Mike, email me, email Katie. Let us know your feedback. And if you're listening to the recorded session later on, thank you for taking time out of your busy day to go through that as well. So again, thank you and have a wonderful weekend.